She wasn't just an empress. She was a storm hiding behind silk curtains. While Claudius ruled Rome by law, Messalina ruled it by desire. Behind palace doors, she turned senators into playthings and rivals into corpses. But when her appetite grew too wild, even Rome gasped in horror. What happens when the most powerful woman in the empire sleeps with the man who wants her husband's throne? You're about to meet the empress whose betrayal led to blood in the gardens. This is the terrifying true story of Valeria Messalina. In the shadowy corridors of the Roman Empire, where power whispered through golden halls and death hid behind every curtain, one woman rose with the grace of a goddess and the venom of a snake. Valeria Messalina. She was just a girl when she married Emperor Claudius in the year 38, but behind her youthful beauty was a mind sharpened like a dagger. She knew that Rome didn't reward innocence. It crowned ruthlessness, and Messalina was ready. As the third wife of Claudius, she wasted no time taking her place beside the throne, not simply as consort, but as queen of secrets, lies, and lust. The empire, drunk on wealth and war, barely noticed the silent storm gathering behind its emperor's back. Messalina, born into a noble family, was no stranger to the manipulations of court life. Her lineage reached back to Augustus himself, and that bloodline brought more than prestige. It brought entitlement. She didn't just want to be remembered, she wanted to be worshipped, feared, and obeyed. Her beauty became her weapon. Soft words and softer skin disarmed senators, seduced generals, and bent even the most powerful to her will. While Claudius focused on laws and provinces, his empress played her own game. One of power seized not through war, but through bedroom whispers and midnight deals. At first, the people adored her. Messalina appeared as the loyal wife and gracious host, organizing grand feasts that left senators bloated with wine and flattery. But behind closed doors, she ran a darker empire within the empire, a kingdom of secrets. She began installing her own allies in positions of power, carefully removing anyone who threatened her control. One by one, rivals vanished. Some were exiled on vague accusations of treason. Others died suddenly, too suddenly. Poison in a goblet, a blade in the bath. And always the smile of the empress remained untouched. Claudius, awkward and easily misled, saw only the obedient wife who warmed his bed. But Rome was beginning to whisper. The guards who stood outside her chambers heard the same male voices visit again and again. Names of noblemen, some married, some barely of age. She didn't care. Her lovers were tools, and each one paid dearly, some with favors, others with silence, and some with their lives. It was said she wore them down and cast them aside like a child grows bored of a toy. And yet, no one dared accuse her directly. Who would challenge the emperor's wife? Who would question the woman who controlled half the Senate through favors, blackmail, and seduction? Her most shocking scheme was still to come. Behind her luxurious lifestyle and endless string of lovers was a growing ambition that reached beyond pleasure. It reached for the throne itself. She began to dream of replacing Claudius altogether, not through daggers but through deception. Rome, she believed, was ready for a new ruler, one who could rule from the shadows while pretending loyalty. The trap was being set. But for now, Messalina continued to entertain, to smile, and to seduce. Her parties grew more lavish. Naked dancers spun through torchlight. Music drowned out the cries of those she had condemned. She built herself a palace within the palace, a secret world where the rules of Rome didn't apply. Every corner of the imperial household was under her watchful eye. Even the emperor's freedmen, his closest advisors, were bribed or threatened into silence. It became clear. Messalina didn't serve Rome. Rome served her. But all this power made her careless. She believed herself untouchable, eternal, invincible. And while Claudius sat on the throne, blissfully ignorant, a slow-burning fuse had been lit beneath the empire. For now, though, Messalina was untouchable. And in the marble chambers of the imperial palace, her name was whispered with awe, fear, and desire. The empress had risen, not by blood, not by law, but by seduction, silence, and sin. And Rome, as always, would bleed for it. Rome, beneath its glittering facades and towering statues, pulsed with rumors. Rumors that walked barefoot through alleyways, clung to the hems of senators' robes, and drifted from slaves' mouths into the ears of generals. And at the center of every whisper was one name, Messalina. Her beauty was not just a gift. It was a curse she wielded like a sword. Her laughter could mean life, her silence, death. She moved through the palace like a wraith, soft, silent, and terrifying. In public, she was the charming empress, smiling beside Claudius during festivals, dropping coins for the poor, and appearing at temples with pious eyes cast downward. But behind the veils of her public image lay a network of secret rooms, secret plans, and secret sins. Messalina had turned the imperial palace into a house of whispers. Her influence now extended far beyond the palace gates. The city's most respected men found themselves summoned in the night, their loyalty tested with a kiss or a command. Refusal meant disgrace, or worse, compliance meant rewards, temporary ones. No one stayed in her favor for long. She had become like a spider, wrapping her victims in silk and draining them dry, and those caught in her web rarely escaped. Even Claudius's freedmen, Narcissus and Pallas, began to notice the increasing flow of secrets slipping past them. They could feel her power growing, but fear kept them silent. Messalina had mastered more than seduction. She had mastered fear. With a single glance, she could suggest ruin. And no one wanted to be her next victim. The Senate became her puppet stage. Laws were changed to suit her desires, properties seized, enemies condemned, and rushed trials where no defense was allowed. Her name was never on the scrolls, but her will echoed in every decree. Rome itself had started to bend around her, reshaping into a reflection of her wants. She had everything, but she wanted more. Messalina began to target the estates of wealthy nobles, accusing them of treason or corruption, then seizing their lands. Her greed knew no bounds. The gardens of Lucullus, once belonging to a sacred order, were stolen after a quiet scandal removed their owners. She walked those gardens barefoot, laughing as if the land had always been hers. It wasn't just wealth she craved, it was legacy. She wanted Rome to remember her, not as an empress, but as a goddess. Her own statues began appearing beside those of Venus and Juno, her name whispered in prayers by terrified priests who dared not refuse her. She created a cult of personality around herself, a religion of one, and made sure everyone worshipped. Behind closed doors, her tastes grew darker. Whispers told of masked parties where morality was discarded like old robes, where senators watched their wives disappear into candlelit corridors with masked strangers, only to emerge pale and shaken. Messalina watched it all from a throne of silk, drinking sweet wine and smiling like a goddess watching mortals dance. Her lovers were no longer chosen for power alone. Some were chosen for cruelty, some for desperation, others just to see how far she could break them. The senator Gaius Silius had begun to appear more frequently at the palace, and their affair was no longer a secret. He was young, striking, and ambitious. But more importantly, he was controllable. Messalina saw in him more than a lover. She saw a weapon. She whispered dreams of power into his ear, promises of a future where they could rule together. He, blinded by lust and ambition, believed her. Together, they began to plot something unthinkable, a new rule without Claudius. A bigamous marriage was suggested, not in secret, but in the open, as a statement to Rome that Messalina no longer needed her husband. The empress was not just playing with fire, she was dousing herself in oil and dancing in the flames. But the empire was vast, and Claudius, though weak and distracted, was still emperor. For now. Her confidence grew each day. She believed herself above the gods, above fate. When a young noble refused her advances, his body was found in the Tiber days later, throat slit. His family was told he had taken his own life. Another man, caught boasting of his night with the empress, vanished without a trace. Even in her pleasure, she demanded silence. Her appetite for power, for control, for men, was unending. But with each step, she moved closer to the edge. Messalina believed herself untouchable. She had forgotten that Rome, though slow to react, never forgets. The city that had once cheered for her was beginning to shift. Some citizens whispered prayers for protection from her gaze. Mothers warned their sons to stay away from the palace. Priests performed secret rites to cleanse the temples she had entered. And in the Forum, old statues were beginning to crack under the weight of her ambition. Still, Messalina marched forward, draped in pearls, her eyes cold and full of fire. The palace echoed with her laughter, her commands, her footsteps in the night. But the walls that protected her were no longer as thick. The people she ruled through fear were beginning to fear her less. The house of whispers had grown too loud, and somewhere in the shadows, something was listening. There were many things Messalina could get away with. She had broken laws, destroyed reputations, ruined families, and danced in the ashes of men's careers. But when she touched Gaius Silius, She crossed a line even Rome could not ignore. He was more than just another lover. He was a nobleman with ambition, a senator with military connections, and a man too bold for his own safety. And Messalina didn't just take him into her bed, she married him. While Emperor Claudius was away in Ostia inspecting grain supplies, Messalina forced Silius into a public wedding. It was not a whisper in the dark, not a secret behind silk curtains. It was loud. It was obscene. It was a direct insult to the emperor. The streets buzzed with disbelief. An empress marrying another man while the emperor still lived. Was it madness? Was it treason? Senators whispered behind locked doors. Slaves passed the gossip like wildfire. And yet for a brief moment, Messalina truly believed she could make Silius emperor. She believed Rome would follow her, that the guards would kneel, and that Claudius would never return. Or if he did, that he would be too weak to resist. Together, she and Silius celebrated. The palace was flooded with wine, music, and wild laughter. Gold coins were thrown into the crowd. Some believed Messalina had already crowned herself queen. She dressed as Venus, with robes too sheer for decency, jewels weighing down her arms, and a crown of roses upon her head. Silius stood beside her like a painted statue, handsome but hollow. He played the part she gave him, but even he began to feel the noose tightening. While Messalina bathed in her own delusion, her enemies were sharpening knives. Narcissus, Claudius's trusted freedman, had long feared her power. He had watched her grow bolder, more dangerous, and now he saw an opportunity. He rushed to Ostia and told Claudius everything: the marriage, the mockery, the betrayal. At first, Claudius didn't believe it. He had always seen Messalina as his loving wife, the mother of his children, the woman who smiled beside him at the games. But when he returned to Rome, he saw the truth written across every face. The city knew. The guards knew. Even the Senate waited to see what he would do. Narcissus took control before Claudius could hesitate. He ordered the arrest of Silius and his co-conspirators. They were dragged from their homes, some still half drunk from the celebrations. Silius was taken to the execution grounds without trial. He begged for mercy, for a chance to speak to the emperor, but none came. His head was removed in silence, the blood soaking into the dirt where dozens had fallen before him. Messalina, however, was not so easily found. When she heard of Claudius's return, she fled the palace in panic. No more silks, no more jewels, just a trembling woman with bare feet and wild eyes. She hid in the gardens of Lucullus, the same gardens she had stolen through deceit. Now they offered no comfort. She sent messengers to Claudius, begging forgiveness, offering her life, her children, anything. She promised to take her own life if he would only spare her family. But Claudius said nothing. He simply sat, stunned, unable to decide. The emperor's weakness had always been his heart, and even now he hesitated. Messalina had one last hope. She thought if she could reach him, if he could just see her face, he would forgive her. So she waited. Hours passed. Her enemies, meanwhile, acted. Narcissus, fearing Claudius would change his mind, sent a centurion with orders to kill her. The soldier found her seated under a tree, weeping, with a dagger in her hand but no courage to use it. Even in the face of death, Messalina couldn't control her fate. The centurion hesitated. He told her to do it herself. She tried, clumsy, shaking, but only wounded herself. So the centurion stepped forward and ended it. The empress who had ruled with lust and fear, who had turned Rome into her personal theater, was now a corpse in a borrowed garden, blood staining the grass. Her body was quietly buried without honor. There was no funeral, no mourning. The name Messalina became a warning, not a memory. Rome tried to forget her, but the stories remained. They echoed in bathhouses, in temples, in the nightmares of those who had once served her. She had nearly brought down an empire. She had nearly replaced the emperor with a puppet, and all of it began with a kiss, a whisper, and a hunger for more. Even in death, her legacy remained, haunting, twisted, and unforgettable. The woman who once made emperors tremble now served as a ghost story, a lesson whispered into the ears of young girls and wide-eyed servants. But some still said she got too close, closer than any woman had ever dared, and Rome would never be the same again. After Messalina's bloody fall, the halls of the imperial palace echoed with more than just silence. They pulsed with fear. The blood on the garden grass had barely dried before Claudius was dragged back into the web of palace politics. His wife had betrayed him, humiliated him, and nearly replaced him. But instead of tightening his grip on power, Claudius retreated into his weakness. Rome needed stability, the Senate demanded reassurance, and the palace needed a new empress. That's when Agrippina arrived, not with fanfare, but with intent sharper than a dagger. She was no ordinary widow. She was the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of Caligula, and most disturbingly, the niece of Claudius. Her bloodline was imperial, her ambitions were terrifying, and her son, young Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, would one day be called Nero. But Agrippina didn't storm the palace like Messalina had. She moved with shadows. While Messalina seduced with her body, Agrippina seduced with legacy, with vision, and with poison hidden behind honeyed words. She whispered to senators, courted the praetorians, and even swayed the cold heart of Narcissus, the very man who had ended Messalina. Rome watched as Claudius, weary and broken, allowed Agrippina to draw closer. Until one night, she didn't leave. The marriage was a scandal, uncle and niece. It broke every moral code the Romans pretended to uphold. But the Senate approved it, eager to prevent another Messalina. Claudius believed he had found safety. What he had truly found was his executioner. Agrippina quickly made it clear she was not to be a decorative wife. She cleaned house with surgical precision. Every official loyal to Messalina was removed. Every whisper of resistance was silenced. Even Lolia Paulina, her rival for Claudius's hand, was exiled and later ordered to commit suicide. Agrippina had learned from Messalina's downfall. She didn't flaunt her power with orgies or open defiance. She wielded it coldly, efficiently, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But the real focus of her ambition was her son. She forced Claudius to adopt him. She demanded he be renamed Nero and given preference over Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. And Claudius, ever the fool, agreed. The boy who once ran barefoot through the halls was now dressed in purple robes and taught to walk like an emperor. Messalina's son, Britannicus, was pushed to the shadows, watched constantly, treated as a threat even before he knew what power meant. Servants began to disappear. Food tasted strange. Doors were locked more often. The palace had turned into a chessboard, and every piece belonged to Agrippina. Claudius grew old fast. His hands trembled. His memory failed. He often stared blankly at the busts of his ancestors, perhaps wondering if one day he'd join them by force. He had married a spider, and the web was now tight around his throat. At night, some said he cried out Messalina's name. Others said he called for her forgiveness. But it didn't matter. Her ghost was powerless. Agrippina had already begun to erase her memory. Statues were pulled down. Names were scratched off monuments. The woman who had nearly taken Rome was now reduced to ashes and forgotten texts. And yet her story lingered. The slaves remembered. The guards remembered. Claudius remembered. Because the empress who came before Agrippina had ruled with desire, not strategy, but both paths led to the same end. Now Rome had traded fire for ice, but ice can be just as deadly. And in the quiet corners of the palace, whispers still echoed. Which wife would be the last? Which son would wear the crown? And how much blood would be spilled before it happened? Rome had seen madness before, but something worse was coming. Something colder, more calculated, and even more merciless than Messalina. The empire was slipping into new hands, and no one, absolutely no one, was safe anymore. The memory of Messalina did not vanish with her corpse. It sank deeper into the palace walls, hiding like rot beneath polished marble, waiting for its moment to return. Though Agrippina had seized control of Claudius, reshaped the palace, and pushed her son Nero to the front of the imperial stage, Rome had not forgotten the empress who once ruled with lust and terror. In hidden taverns and candlelit bedrooms, the people still whispered her name with equal parts horror and fascination. Messalina had made enemies during her reign, yes, but she had also made allies. Secret ones, slaves who owed their lives to her mercy, guards who once thrilled at her seductions, senators whose careers had blossomed under her favor. They did not speak aloud, for Agrippina's spies crawled through every corner of the empire, but their hatred lived on. Claudius, increasingly weak and surrounded by wolves, found himself haunted by Messalina's name. He drank more wine, stumbled through speeches, and often awoke screaming from dreams soaked in blood and perfume. He no longer saw Agrippina as salvation, but as a cold executioner holding his fate in her hands. He tried to reach for Britannicus, Messalina's son, but the boy was kept away, watched constantly, and treated more like a prisoner than an heir. Claudius would stare at his own son across the marble floors of the dining hall and wonder silently why he felt like a stranger. Because Nero, Agrippina's golden boy, was now the center of everything. Sculptors carved his image into stone, teachers whispered tales of his brilliance, and musicians composed hymns to his future greatness. But the boy who was promised the throne was not without darkness. Even as a child, Nero showed signs of cruelty. He laughed when animals were tortured in the arena, sneered at the poor, and once pushed a servant down the stairs simply for looking at him. Agrippina saw it all and encouraged it. Power, she said, belonged to the ruthless. Claudius, meanwhile, began muttering about changing his will. He spoke to his freedmen in hushed tones about restoring Britannicus as heir. He ordered old scrolls retrieved from the archives, scrolls that told of Messalina's final days, the accusations, the betrayal, the hurried execution. Some nights he locked himself in the library, rereading her last words as if searching for proof of innocence. But Rome was no longer his to shape. Agrippina had already begun her final move. She summoned the poisoner Locusta, a woman infamous for her brews that killed without a trace. With chilling calm, Agrippina arranged a feast, inviting nobles, servants, even musicians to make it seem festive. She made sure Claudius was relaxed. She poured his wine herself. She watched him eat. And later that night, as he began to convulse, vomit, and scream, she ordered all doors locked. When the emperor began foaming at the mouth, she summoned his physician, not to save him, but to ensure his death. The doctor, perhaps afraid or already paid off, slid a feather dipped in poison down Claudius's throat to finish the job. Rome awoke the next morning to news of the emperor's natural death. The streets were filled with forced mourning, black drapes hung from temples, and every citizen was told to bow their heads and remember the great Claudius. But in truth, Messalina had finally won. The husband who killed her had now been killed by her ghost, for it was the fear of her memory, the return of her son, the undoing of Agrippina, that drove her successor to murder. Britannicus, now just a boy, wept silently while Nero was paraded through the streets as the new heir, his mother standing tall, dressed in imperial purple, her face unreadable. The Senate met and, without true debate, named Nero the next emperor. Messalina's son was overlooked, passed like a shadow between pillars of power, his future stolen by poison and fear. But even as Nero sat upon the throne, even as Agrippina whispered in his ear and controlled the empire through her son, the ghost of Messalina was not silent. She lived in the cracks of the palace, in the glances between old servants, in the half-spoken prayers of those who remembered. And her son, though young and caged, was not without rage. He had seen what Rome had done to his mother. He had watched his father's slow descent into madness. And deep within him, a fire began to burn. Messalina was dead, yes, but the story was far from over. The empire had not rid itself of her legacy. It had simply delayed the reckoning. And as Rome celebrated its new emperor, few noticed the boy left behind, watching, learning, and waiting. Waiting for the day when blood would answer blood. Nero now sat on the throne, a teenage emperor cloaked in gold. But it was not his power alone that ruled Rome. It was the iron grip of his mother, Agrippina, who moved behind him like a spider spinning webs in the dark. She stood taller than any general, fiercer than any senator, her voice soft but soaked in venom. The moment Claudius's body cooled, she reshaped the empire in her image. Statues of her were raised beside her sons. Coins bore both their faces. Decrees were signed with her name, and Nero's intertwined. She claimed she was safeguarding Rome, but the city knew the truth. Messalina was gone, but the poison in the palace had only changed form. Still, there remained one threat, one fragile, trembling boy who reminded Rome that Nero was not Claudius's true heir. Britannicus, the son of Messalina, the last ember of a bloodline silenced too soon. At first, the boy was kept out of sight, fed lies, paraded like a pet when needed. He was told that his time would come, that Nero would share power, that the empire was big enough for them both. But Britannicus had grown silent and careful. He no longer wept in public. He watched, he listened. He remembered how his mother had screamed before her death, how his father had crumbled under Agrippina's touch. He had survived in shadows, but now he was nearing manhood, and with it came danger. People still whispered his name. Soldiers remembered his father. Senators, weary of Agrippina's control, began to ask, why not Britannicus? He is the true son. Nero heard it. Agrippina felt it. And so, the boy had to die. But Agrippina's hands were too bloodied already. She feared a public backlash. Nero, however, was learning fast. He smiled more often, laughed with cruelty, and carried secrets like daggers. The new emperor decided to act alone. He would kill Britannicus not in secret, not with stealth, but in plain sight, before the eyes of Rome, and still make it seem like nothing at all. He planned a dinner, a celebration, a harmless gathering of nobles and family. The air was filled with music, perfume, and flattery. Britannicus, still thin and quiet, was seated beside Nero. The two appeared as brothers, though only one knew the feast was a trap. Nero had hired a poisoner, one who understood pain and silence. The drink was prepared carefully, not too fast, not too slow, enough to destroy without suspicion. But something unexpected happened. Britannicus took the first sip and, almost instantly, began to tremble. His eyes rolled, his hands twitched, his skin paled to a ghostly white. He collapsed forward, choking on his own breath. Gasps echoed through the hall. Some rose to help, but Nero raised his hand calmly. "He is prone to fits," he said, with a charming smile. "He'll recover." Servants rushed in, dragged the dying boy away, and the music resumed. The guests, terrified but obedient, returned to their meals. That night, Britannicus died alone in a dark chamber, with no mother to hold him, no father to avenge him. He died like a discarded shadow, his voice silenced forever. The next morning, no mourning was declared. No statues were built, no justice was sought. Nero claimed he had died from illness. Rome moved on. But in the hearts of the people, a cold shiver began to spread. Nero had learned to kill, not with violence, but with performance. With poison disguised as wine, with murder disguised as ceremony. Agrippina, watching from her chamber, knew she had created something monstrous. She had wanted a puppet, but her son was slipping the strings. He had killed Messalina's boy, not just to secure power, but to prove something. He was no longer a child. The palace now pulsed with a new kind of fear. Servants whispered in corners. Advisors walked on eggshells. Anyone could be next. Nero, once soft and unsure, had discovered the thrill of bloodshed. And worse, he had discovered how easy it was to get away with it. Somewhere in the city, someone scratched a message onto a wall. "Messalina's ghost walks Rome, but it is Nero who kills." The empire, once ruled by emperors who fought on battlefields, was now ruled by silence, secrets, and cups of poisoned wine. And though Britannicus was gone, though his name was erased from records and his memory buried in darkness, his death had left a curse. Rome could feel it, like a chill before a storm. The boy had died, yes, but his murder would not be the last. The palace that once echoed with Agrippina's footsteps now trembled beneath her silence. She had forged the path for Nero's rise, poisoning her enemies, charming the Senate, and crushing every threat. But now the emperor she built was no longer her son. He was something else, something wild, something unpredictable. At first, Agrippina believed she still held control. She reminded Nero of his debt to her, whispered commands into his ear, reminded him of the empire she had delivered into his hands. But Nero was no longer listening. He smiled at her in public, kissed her hand like a loyal son, but behind closed doors he plotted. The murder of Britannicus had marked a shift. Nero had tasted power and blood, and both had made him feel alive. But his mother's presence, her looming shadow, began to suffocate him. She criticized his affairs, mocked his love for the actress Poppaea Sabina, and scorned his desire for independence. Nero had grown into a creature of appetites and rage, and Agrippina had become an obstacle that had to be removed. The thought of killing her haunted him at first. She was his mother. She had held him as a child. She had destroyed for him, but she had also humiliated him, belittled him, and now refused to let him rule freely. He began by stripping her of power. Her guards were removed, her titles revoked, her influence in the Senate vanished. But Agrippina did not beg. She did not cry. She smiled. She told Nero she was proud of his strength, proud that he had become a man, and this terrified him even more. He had tried to push her away, but she stayed close, patient, and composed. It was not enough to exile her, not enough to silence her. She had to die. But how does one kill a mother and still look like an emperor? Nero turned to a twisted idea. He would kill her without laying a finger. He ordered a ship to be prepared, a gift for Agrippina, a magnificent vessel adorned with luxury, a sign of peace. He invited her to sail with friends. She accepted, smiling, knowing full well that this was not a gift but a trap. As the ship glided across the moonlit waters, the mechanism hidden beneath the floor was triggered. The ceiling collapsed, and the hull split open like a cracked skull. Screams echoed across the bay as the vessel broke apart. Some were thrown into the sea, others drowned instantly. Agrippina, clever and alert, was not among them. She had jumped free, swimming toward the shore with the strength of a woman who had survived every other attempt on her life. When she reached land, she sent word to Nero. "I have survived. May you come to greet me." Nero panicked. The plan had failed. The city would laugh. The Senate would stir. And worst of all, Agrippina was alive. That night, he sent assassins to her villa under the cover of darkness. No trial, no declaration, just cold steel and silence. They entered her chambers and found her lying on her couch waiting. She did not fight. She did not scream. She simply pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here, the place that bore your emperor." And so they did. When morning came, the news spread that Agrippina had committed suicide, a lie so thin it barely covered the blood on Nero's hands. Rome knew. The Senate knew. The people knew. But no one spoke. Statues of her were taken down. Her name erased from public monuments. Her grave was hidden, but her ghost never left. From that day forward, Nero changed. His eyes grew darker, his laughter more hollow. He had killed the woman who made him emperor, and with her death, the last thread of his humanity snapped. He turned to pleasures more vile, to advisors more cruel, and to a path paved with corpses. Agrippina had once ruled through silence, seduction, and steel. Now she ruled from the grave. Nero could not escape her. He dreamed of her face, pale and dripping with seawater. He drank more wine, burned more incense, but nothing washed the blood from his hands. The empire was now his alone, but it was a kingdom of shadows. Rome had watched a mother raise an emperor, and an emperor murder his mother. And the whisper that once followed Messalina's death returned, louder than before. Rome devours its queens, but their ghosts remain. With Agrippina buried in secret and Rome soaked in a fearful silence, Nero was no longer an emperor bound by restraint. He was a god in his own mind, and Rome his stage. No longer content with ruling from marble halls, Nero sought the spotlight, the applause, the adoration that no army or senate could provide. He dressed in silk robes, painted his face like a performer, and stepped onto the public stage to sing, act, and play the lyre. Rome's aristocrats, generals, and scholars were forced into the audience, heads bowed, pretending to admire the emperor's every off-key note, every clumsy dance. Behind their fake smiles, fear gnawed at their souls. To criticize was to die, to laugh was to vanish. Nero was no longer just a ruler, he was a spectacle. But when applause wasn't loud enough, when praise wasn't poured with trembling hands, he took it by force. Senators who failed to praise his performance were accused of treason. Soldiers were ordered to cheer louder. And the Roman streets began to feel like a theater turned graveyard, where silence was as dangerous as dissent. Yet the bloodletting didn't stop at the theater's edge. The more Nero performed, the more detached he became from reality. He saw himself as Orpheus, Apollo, even Jupiter. And when Rome failed to worship him enough, he decided it needed a tragedy, a true performance, one that would be remembered forever. On a hot July night, flames erupted in the Circus Maximus. They spread fast, feeding on wooden stalls, oil-drenched beams, and tightly packed homes. As Rome burned, screams echoed through the streets. Families leapt from rooftops, temples collapsed into ash, and the Tiber glowed red with reflection of fire. The city was an inferno, but Nero, he stood watching from a distance, not with horror, but with inspiration. Dressed in robes of gold, he strummed his lyre and sang of the burning of Troy. This was his stage now. This was his masterpiece. When the fires finally died, 10 of Rome's 14 districts were destroyed. Thousands were dead or missing, homeless citizens huddled in ruins. Whispers spread like smoke. Nero started it. They said he lit the flames to clear space for a new palace. They said he wanted a city worthy of a god. Whether he started the fire or not didn't matter anymore. Rome believed he did. So Nero needed a scapegoat. He turned his wrath on a growing religious cult, the Christians. Strange, secretive, and already disliked, they were perfect targets. He declared them arsonists, enemies of Rome, and ordered mass executions. Christians were dragged from homes, nailed to crosses, burned alive in public gardens, sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or set ablaze to light Nero's feasts. Rome was horrified, but silent. To speak was to burn. And amid the suffering, Nero unveiled his grand dream. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace of impossible wealth, stretching over the ruins of the homes he had destroyed. Its halls shimmered with gold leaf. Walls were painted with frescoes of gods that looked suspiciously like Nero himself. A revolving dining room spun with the stars, while perfume sprayed from hidden fountains. It was not a palace, it was a monument to madness. Outside, Rome mourned. Inside, Nero feasted. He invited senators to dine while slaves choked on incense smoke. He forced nobles to act in plays, dressed them in women's robes, shaved their heads, and laughed as they stumbled through tragic roles. It was not theater, it was humiliation. Rome's pride was now Nero's plaything, and the people began to ask, is this still an emperor, or has the empire become a circus? Even those closest to him began to waver. Old friends disappeared, advisors were executed, generals distanced themselves. Yet Nero sang louder, danced longer, smiled wider. He believed Rome loved him, or would be forced to. But deep within the shadows of the empire, a storm was building. Provinces that once bowed to Rome now whispered of rebellion. Soldiers in distant lands watched their emperor prance in costume while their comrades starved. The Senate, once reduced to clapping hands, began to grit its teeth. Rome had survived tyrants, madmen, and monsters, but never a man who burned it for applause. And behind the golden walls of the Domus Aurea, Nero remained blind to the darkness that crept toward him, wrapped in the very smoke he had summoned. The empire was cracking, and soon not even a god could stand on such broken ground. As the sun rose over the ruins of Rome, casting long shadows across the ashes of homes and temples, Nero still believed he was invincible. He strutted through the halls of his golden house like a deity descended to earth, wrapped in robes laced with pearls and singing verses only he understood. But outside his palace, the empire was crumbling. The provinces, long silent under the weight of Rome's power, began to rise. Rebellions stirred in Gaul and Spain, and even the legions, those loyal blades of the empire, turned their backs on Nero's songs. General Galba, old and austere, was declared emperor by his troops in Hispania. When Nero heard the news, he laughed, calling Galba a senile fool, and ordered actors to perform a parody of him. But Galba wasn't playing games. His army marched east, gaining support with every step, while governors in Africa and Egypt refused to send grain to Rome. Starvation loomed, riots broke out. Nero's precious applause had turned into the thunder of boots and the crackle of torches. In desperation, Nero returned to the Senate, hoping to summon the loyalty of the men he once humiliated. But the senators, long silenced and forced to cheer as Nero danced in drag or married a slave boy in mock ceremonies, offered him only cold stares. The Praetorian Guard, once his personal shield, now accepted bribes to betray him. As news came that they had declared Galba emperor, Nero fled his palace in panic. He paced the corridors of the Domus Aurea, weeping, begging the gods or anyone to save him. He had no plan, only fear. He asked his remaining slaves, "Is it not shameful to die?" None answered. In the dark of night, disguised in common rags, Nero slipped from his palace and rode with a handful of loyal freedmen to a small villa outside the city, belonging to one of his few remaining friends. There, hiding in a cellar, he heard the hooves of soldiers approaching. Rome wanted him arrested, alive if possible, to be paraded, mocked, and executed publicly. For the first time in his life, Nero faced something he couldn't control, couldn't seduce, couldn't destroy with a command. He was alone. He trembled. Sweat poured from his face as he tried to write a final speech, but his hands shook too much to hold the pen. "What an artist dies in me," he whispered, not about the empire, or the people, or the gods, but himself. When soldiers surrounded the villa, Nero knew the end had come. He ordered a loyal freedman to help him drive a dagger into his throat, but he hesitated. The man forced his hand, and Nero fell to the floor, choking on his own blood. His final words, choked through gasps, were, "Too late. This is far too late." He died not as a god, not as an emperor, but as a frightened, broken man hiding in the mud. When the soldiers entered, they found his body cold, eyes wide open in horror. The Senate rejoiced. Rome celebrated. Statues of Nero were torn down, coins melted, paintings scraped from walls. His name was cursed. It was declared that no future emperor would ever bear the name Nero. But the scars he left, on Rome, on its people, on its soul, never fully healed. The Christians, once hunted and burned in his gardens, remembered him as the beast of Revelation. His cruelty became legend. His madness became warning. And yet, in the darkest corners of the empire, rumors stirred that Nero wasn't truly dead, that he had escaped, that he would return with fire in his hands and a crown on his head. Even years later, false Neros appeared, trying to claim his identity. Such was the madness he left behind. An empire so twisted by his reign, it could no longer tell the difference between a god and a monster. And so ended the life of Nero Claudius, Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the man who thought himself divine, who danced while Rome burned, and who mistook fear for love, silence for loyalty, and cruelty for strength. Echoes of a monster. Long after Nero's death, the fire he lit continued to burn. Not in the streets of Rome, but in the minds of its people. His golden house was stripped of its jewels, flooded with earth, and buried beneath future emperors' monuments, as if Rome itself tried to suffocate the memory of his madness. But you cannot bury a nightmare. It lingers in the walls, in whispered stories passed from mother to child, in the night terrors of those who once watched family members vanish at Nero's command. Even the emperors who followed him feared his shadow. Domitian built palaces to rival Nero's, but never dared call himself a god. Trajan ruled with iron discipline, carefully avoiding the excesses that led to Nero's collapse. And yet, Nero's name still stirred something dangerous, something seductive. For centuries, the empire was haunted by rumors that Nero hadn't truly died, that he had fled east, gathering armies in secret, waiting to reclaim his throne. 3 impostors even rose in his name, each one claiming to be the emperor returned from death. And the terrifying part? People believed them. That was the depth of Nero's legacy. He had become more than a man. He had become a symbol, a warning, a phantom, a curse. The Christians, who once burned in his gardens like human torches, saw him as the very face of evil. In the book of Revelation, he became the beast, the Antichrist who would return in the end times to destroy the world. Nero in death was more powerful than Nero in life. His songs were gone, his statues destroyed, his empire shattered. But his myth survived. It crept into opera, poetry, drama. Artists painted him with a lyre while the world burned behind him. Writers depicted him not as a man, but as the madness of unchecked power made flesh. He became a universal lesson. What happens when one man is given absolute control, and no one dares say no? And so centuries later, we ask ourselves, what do we truly remember about Nero? Was he a lunatic artist, desperate for applause? A sadistic tyrant who murdered those he loved? Or simply a man shaped by fear, power, in a world that rewarded cruelty over compassion? The answer doesn't matter. What matters is this: we still speak his name. And when we do, we remember the danger of forgetting the past. Because when monsters wear crowns and dance in golden halls, empires fall in silence, and fire always returns. If this story chilled you, shocked you, or made you question how far power can corrupt, then don't let Nero's legacy fade. Subscribe to our channel for more haunting tales from history. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Comment below, was Nero a monster, or just a man born in the wrong time? And remember, some rulers die, but their shadows never leave us.